Hi, Chad with Versa-Matic. Today we're going to show you how to install an airing kit into our E2 non-metallic pump. Out front we have examples of our airing kit and our wet end kit for our E2 non-metallic pump. The rebuild you're going to see is accurate in man method and machine, but for video purposes, some parts of the work performed have been condensed in time. At any point during the presentation, please pause this video until you have completed any part of the process. The pump we are using in this presentation has been built new and is considerably easier to work with than a pump that has been used in the process. Additional time may be required in the preparation and separation of parts and components during the rebuild. Identifying which kit is required for your repair has become easier on newer pumps, with the permanently affixed metal serial number tag that now indicates the wet end and airing kit information for the pump. Kit information can also be found in the service and operating manual. Versamatic genuine replacement parts wet end and airing kits provide a bill of material of the components included in the kit. All items included in the kits are components that Versamatic recommends replacing when rebuilding a pump. The pump we are using today is an example of the ease of kit installation. Always consult your respective service and operating manual before performing any maintenance on your pump. Service and operating manuals include composite repair parts drawings, repair parts list, and torque specifications. For service and operating manuals or more information, visit us on the web at www.versamatic.com. Always remember that safety is the highest priority. When working on or around any equipment, always follow the correct safety procedures. Always read and follow the safety warnings and instructions in the service manual before any work is started on the pump. For more information, see the Warren Rupp video on safety at Versamatic.com. Our air end rebuild today will include glide rings, O-rings, and gaskets. These are the recommended tools used with the rebuild. While the sizes may change based on the model, the type will remain the same. Light grease, 12-inch pry bars, O-ring pick, torque wrench, 1/2-inch drive ratchet, 3/8 drive ratchet, snap ring pliers, sockets and or wrenches, 3/8 inch, 1/2 inch, 7/16 inch, 9/16 inch, 1.25 inch socket, 5/32 inch socket head Allen wrench. Alright, let's get started. For ease of assembly and disassembly, today we're going to use a 3/8 drive impact gun. We'll start off by removing the discharge manifold. Now remove the main air valve assembly. Set the main air valve assembly aside for later disassembly. Now remove the suction manifold. Once you have the suction manifold off, go ahead and set aside for the removal of the check balls. Now remove the valve seat O-rings and the valve seats. Remove the check balls and the valve seat O-rings. Now we're going to remove the discharge valve seat O-rings and valve seats. And check balls. Now we're ready to remove one outer chamber. Once you have the outer chamber removed, go ahead and set aside for later reassembly. Now remove one diaphragm assembly. You may get the diaphragm assembly or you may get diaphragm assembly to the rod. Remove the outer plate and save for later reassembly. Remove the inner diaphragm plate for later reassembly and the plastic washer. Now remove the opposite outer chamber. And set aside this outer chamber for later reassembly. Remove the diaphragm assembly that is attached to the rod. Go ahead and set this aside for later disassembly. Now we're going to remove the inner chamber. Once you get this inner chamber removed, go ahead and set aside, remove the inner chamber gasket, and discard. Now we're ready to remove the bumper O-ring from the pilot spool. Remove the pilot spool assembly. Remove the opposite inner chamber and set aside for later reassembly. Remove the inner chamber gasket and discard. And now remove both main shaft O-rings and discard. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now remove our pilot sleeve assembly by removing the snap ring. You may need to push the pilot sleeve assembly through with a socket or a nut driver, pull out from the opposite end. Once you remove the pilot sleeve assembly, set aside for later rebuild. Now we're ready to install our airing kit. Apply grease to the main shaft bushing. Be sure to fully seat the main shaft O-ring into the designated groove of the main shaft bushing. Repeat this process for the opposite side. Now we're ready to remove the old O-rings from the pilot sleeve assembly. Inspect the pilot sleeve assembly for any wear or damage. Replace as needed. Be sure to seat the new pilot sleeve assembly O-rings into the grooves. Apply grease to our pilot bore. This is to help ensure we don't roll, nick, or damage any of the pilot sleeve O-rings. Once you fully seat the pilot sleeve, go ahead and install our snap ring on the opposite side. Make sure you get the snap ring installed into the groove. Be sure to align our center block gaskets with all the bolt holes and porting holes. Check the machine surfaces on the inner chamber for a good sealing surface. Be sure that we don't have any dents or dings or scratches. Be sure to align all bolt holes, pilot porting holes. Be sure to torque the inner chamber bolts to the specified torque listed in the service manual. Now repeat this process for the opposite side. Be sure to align our center block gaskets with all the bolt holes and porting holes. Check the machine surfaces on the inner chamber. Be sure to torque the inner chamber bolts to the specified torque. Now we're ready to remove our pilot spool O-rings. Once you remove the O-rings, be sure to inspect the pilot spool for any damage, scarring, or scratching, and just replace as needed. When installing the pilot spool O-rings, go ahead and install the bumper O-ring on one end and work your way in. But be sure to leave off one bumper O-ring for reassembly purposes. Apply a little grease to all O-rings on the pilot spool. Be sure that we don't roll, nick, or damage any of these O-rings. Once you have the pilot spool assembly installed, now you can install the last bumper O-ring. Be sure the pilot spool will shift freely within the pilot sleeve assembly. Apply a little grease to the main shaft so we don't damage the main shaft O-ring. Be sure to align all the bolt holes with the diaphragm in the inner chamber. Once the bolt holes are aligned, we're ready to install one outer chamber. Inspect the outer chamber radius where the diaphragm rolls across for any sharp edges. Lightly address those sharp edges with an emery cloth or crocus cloth. Inspect the ball guides, the machine surfaces on the suction side and the discharge side. You can lightly address those sharp edges of the ball guides if needed. Note the orientation of the outer chamber with the center of the pump. The discharge of the outer chamber should face towards the main air valve assembly. When tightening all the bolts, be sure to torque to specification and tighten them in a star pattern. Now on the opposite side of installing our diaphragm assembly, be sure to install plastic bumper washer first. Now inspect the inner diaphragm plate just as we did on the first side. Inspect the radius for any sharp edges and address as needed or replace as needed. Be sure to install the radius of the inner diaphragm plate towards the diaphragm. Here we've inverted the diaphragm, so we have the air side of the diaphragm facing towards the inner diaphragm plate. When inspecting our outer diaphragm plate, inspect the radius for any sharp edges. Address those sharp edges as needed. Now we can shift the diaphragm across using a set of pry bars. Be sure to get up underneath the inner diaphragm plate so we don't damage the new diaphragm. Once the diaphragm assembly is shifted across, you can roll the diaphragm back to its natural shape of natural bulge out. And torque the diaphragm assembly to the specified torque. If you achieve torque between bolt holes, always go to the next hole. Inspect the machine surfaces of the outer chambers. Note the orientation of the outer chamber. The discharge side of the outer chamber should face towards the main air valve assembly. Install our outer chamber bolts. When tightening down the outer chamber, be sure to tighten the bolts in a cross pattern and torque to specification. Install our suction side check balls. Install our valve seat O-rings. Here we have 2 O-rings per valve seat. Inspect the valve seats for any damage, scarring, or scratching, and replace as needed. Note the chamfer on the valve seat will face towards the check ball. Repeat this process for the opposite valve seat on the suction side. Now install the other 2 valve seat O-rings that will seal our valve seats to our suction manifold. Inspect the suction manifold machine surfaces and the integrity of the casting, and replace as needed. Orientation of the manifold is based on process requirements and may be reinstalled in either direction. Torque the suction manifold bolts to the recommended torque spec located in the service manual. Now we're ready to disassemble our air valve assembly. Once you remove both end caps from our main air valve assembly, Go ahead and discard the old end cap gaskets. Remove the main air valve spool. And then use a socket or a tool to remove the main air valve sleeve. Inspect the main air valve body for any damage, scarring, scratching, or any sharp edges. Now remove the old O-rings from the main air valve sleeve and discard. We're going to replace these O-rings with new ones from our airing kit. Inspect the main air valve sleeve for any scarring, scratching, or damage, and just replace as needed. Be sure when you're installing the new main air valve sleeve O-rings to fully seat into the designated groove on the outside of the sleeve. Once you have all the O-rings installed, put a light lubricant on these O-rings and put a light lubricant within the air valve body to be sure we don't roll, nick, or damage any of the sleeve O-rings upon installation. We're going to discard the old glide ring assembly. It's a two-piece assembly. You have a carbon Teflon glide ring, and underneath that is an Energizer O-ring that also needs to be removed. Once you get all the glide ring assemblies removed, we're going to install our new glide ring assemblies by putting the new O-ring on first. Once you have all the O-rings installed, then we put our glide ring over top of the O-ring. Apply a light grease to the valve spool. When installing the main air valve spool into the sleeve, be sure to compress the glide rings. This will help ensure that we don't damage the glide rings upon reassembly. Now we're ready to install and align all of our holes of our end cap gasket. Be sure to align all the bolt holes in the pilot porting hole. Go ahead and repeat this process for the second side. Now install our main air valve gasket. Be sure to align all the bolt holes and pilot porting holes. Otherwise the pump won't shift if it's installed incorrectly. Then torque the main air valve assembly to the center block to the specified torque. Inspect our discharge manifold, ball guides, and valve seat area for any damage or sharp edges, and address those sharp edges or damage with a light sandpaper or replace as needed. Be sure to fully seat all valve seat O-rings. Now install our check balls. Inspect the valve seats for any damage or wear and replace as needed. Note the chamfer will face towards the check ball. Lastly, install valve seat O-ring that will seal up against the outer chamber. The orientation of the discharge manifold depends on the user's application. When retightening the discharge manifold, be sure to torque to factory specification in an across pattern. That completes our airside rebuild. When doing a complete rebuild, see our wet side video, or for additional information, find us on the web at Versamatic.com or contact after-sales support at service.versamatic@idexcorp.com. Thank you.